The Conductor's Tale. Tobias Rain drove the line, not the Atlantis Spire, that grand space elevator ribboning down through the stratosphere to the equatorial Atlantic far below, but the network above it, a spiderweb of transit tethers stretching across geostationary orbit, linking dozens of orbital stations and habitats into the vast arcology known as Hylantis. He wasn't a captain, or a pilot, or a space liner commander, just a conductor, as his badge read in old-fashioned brass script. A quiet title for a quiet job, guiding morning trams between O'Neill cylinders and Stanford toruses, agrospheres and manufactories, the smaller habs in the hinterlands that supported vast solar farms, and even the dry docks of Tethered Station, where the skeletal frames of interstellar arcs could be seen under construction. Tobias went to all these places and back again, day after day, year after year, high above the turning Earth. To his passengers, Tobias was something of an anachronism, a figure better suited to a gilded luxury rail in 1925 than a tether tram in 2525. But conductors were permitted their eccentricities. To the casual passenger, it was unclear whether he was a quirky baseline human or an AI running the train from behind a lifelike android shell. Most didn't particularly care. They had their own destinations, their own thoughts, their own amusements. Some chatted quietly with fellow riders, others admired the view, great arcs of silver and green slowly drifting by, with Earth hanging always below. Many more simply stared into their overlays on their smart glasses or neural implants, lost in private worlds even as they traveled through the greatest one ever built. Hylantis was one of the oldest and largest orbital arcologies, under constant expansion since the days when Tethered Station was little more than a space dock. Back then, it served asteroid miners who stopped to unload cargo, patch holes, refuel tanks, and swap stories over drinks. It still did, but like many port towns in history, it had grown, not just outward, but upward and inward, until it became a city in orbit. Tobias had always found it poetic that for every ship that launched from Tethered Station, with colonists bound for new worlds, whether to Mars, Titan, or stars farther still, just as many people were moving to orbit around Earth itself. But he supposed it made sense. Most people still wanted to live on Earth, and if not there, then at least close to it. Every bit of land on the planet was in use by now. Not only the dense concrete jungles many had once predicted, though there were still plenty of those, but also vast protected preserves, old tribal lands, family farms, national parks, places whose owners simply had no interest in seeing them developed or would sell them only at astronomical prices. And so for those seeking more living space, the solution was clear: move upward into space. Over the decades, Tobias had transported countless passengers from the Atlantis Spire terminal to their new homes in one of the many habitats webbed together to form the sprawl of Hylantis. Some were families chasing opportunity, others were students, workers, or retirees. A few were idealists, dreamers with bright eyes and big plans. Others were just tired of waiting for their place on Earth to open up. He had seen all types, and though they rarely remembered him for long, Tobias remembered many of them. He didn't need names, just faces, moments, small stories told in passing. A child pressing their nose to the viewport, glimpsing Earth's oceans. A newlywed couple holding hands as they disembarked at Habitat Lucian. An older couple with hiking gear, waiting for a glimpse of New Yosemite. A farmer from the African interior, marveling at the agrospheres and joking they looked like the cablashes of his youth. The line never stopped, not truly. Somewhere, someone was always in motion, heading to a new home, a new job, a new beginning. And Tobias Rain was there to take them, humming softly as the tram glided along the tethers, the city's arteries, stretching onward in every direction. In another age, it might have been called a miracle. Now, it was simply a commute. Why megacities in space? On Earth, an arcology is usually depicted as a giant skyscraper or megastructure housing an entire city, often including agriculture. However, the original concept, being a portmanteau of architecture and ecology, generally referred to something more like a collection of buildings and land that was largely self-sufficient and sustainable, both ecologically and economically. In many ways, it was a modernized approach to the classic pre-industrial village, where most of the economy was local, with minimal imports or exports, and where tax and trade were usually done in goods rather than coin. When we look at space, though, that kind of local sustainability and self-sufficiency becomes mandatory relatively early on. In that sense, all habitats, space stations, and even spaceships end up embracing the arcology concept to some extent. Today, I thought we'd explore what that looks like, both in terms of habitat conglomerations, as we'll examine later this month, and also the science fiction notion of the arcology as a megastructure, a self-contained city, only in orbit. And with that in mind, we'll be introducing a new megastructure concept today, the spiral habitat, a rotating habitat designed with more urban densities in mind. The 4 foundational assumptions of space habitat design. Now, there are 4 big, important factors that have consistently shaped how we envision space habitats. Why the classic images tend to show vast rotating rings, cylinders filled with greenery, gardens, and soil. These concepts aren't just about aesthetics or nostalgia from Earth. They emerge from very real engineering constraints and biological needs. In short, space habitats, especially those designed for long-term or permanent habitation, must solve for food production, radiation shielding, light and heat management, and rotational symmetry to simulate gravity. Each of these is a significant design driver, and they all pull toward large-scale structures with open layouts, rather than tightly packed skyscraper-like designs. First, there's food. While it's easy to imagine a space station importing its meals, any truly independent settlement will need to grow its own. That requires space for agriculture, both for staple crops and supplemental greenery, and agricultural systems need much more than a few trays of lettuce under LED lights. Traditional soil-based or even hydroponic growing setups demand significant volume, especially if you're aiming for dietary variety and resilience. The more people you have, the more space you need for food, and since most plants prefer growing under full spectrum, high-intensity light, similar to Earth's sunlight, this introduces new challenges in heat and lighting. That leads into our second factor, light and heat. Plants don't just want light, they want a lot of it. The amount of light plants need to photosynthesize efficiently is far higher than humans need for indoor comfort. It's the difference between reading by a lamp and bathing in noonday sunlight. Indeed, it's a ratio around 1 to 100. That kind of brightness produces a lot of waste heat, and in the vacuum of space, getting rid of that heat is difficult. There's no air to conduct it away, only radiation into space. That means we can't just stack farms vertically in a tight tower without serious cooling systems, which in turn increase the power and mass requirements. Whereas space has got plenty of space to expand, so why cram things together? As a result, many habitat designs opt for wide, single-layer or shallow multi-level structures, where sunlight or artificial light can be distributed efficiently and heat can be managed across large radiating surfaces. Third, there's radiation shielding. Unlike Earth, space offers no natural magnetic field or atmosphere to protect against solar and cosmic radiation. For crops and livestock, it's bad enough, but for humans, it's unacceptably high. Shielding is usually done with mass, lots of it. Often that's achieved by using regolith or water, but one clever approach is to use both together as soil itself doing the shielding. Agricultural soil, with proper depth and moisture content, can serve double duty, protecting the inhabitants and feeding them. Here's the interesting thing though. Most space habitat designs call for around 99% of the mass to be dirt and water, and only a small percent to be structural material itself, and a meter or more of dirt at that, because you need so much for shielding. You really do not need a whole meter of soil for agriculture, not for most crops anyway, but it's a good excuse for lakes and hills and forests and habitats. Fourth and finally, there's rotation and symmetry. In order to simulate gravity, most space habitats rely on centrifugal force, spinning the habitat to create artificial gravity along the outer edge. But spinning structures must be symmetrical to avoid gravity altering hugely during each spin, which is usually just a few minutes at most, or wobbling or tearing themselves apart. That's one of the reasons we see so many ringworlds, cylinders, and even space toruses in science fiction. They are naturally stable when spinning and distribute forces evenly. It also helps with planning, putting residences, farms, and industry into predictable arcs or modules. These symmetrical layouts also help manage the direction of lighting and heat flow, making the most of limited space and resources. Flawed assumptions and specialized habitats. Now, what's wrong with all of that? Well, nothing specifically. But everything we just said about radiation shielding, food, and habitat design could apply to Earth just as well, and yet we still build massive cities that import their food. In space, the equivalent might be a smaller cylindrical habitat, mostly automated, devoted to agriculture, where soil is just deep enough to grow crops. We might tolerate a bit more radiation exposure there, since the seeds for future planting can be grown or stored in better shielded facilities. After all, there's no real issue with eating food that's absorbed a bit more radiation than we prefer, so long as the microbes in the soil are doing fine, and you're not raising people inside the grow dome. Even for livestock, it's not a huge concern. Cancer is not contagious, and we're not raising pigs, chickens, or cattle to live long, happy retirements. They don't need to be shielded from every cosmic ray for decades, just long enough to reach market weight. And if you do want to be more cautious, you can raise breeding stock in more protected environments while growing meat animals in lower shielded ones. So we still have a reason to grow some crops and livestock in better shielded areas, mostly for breeding and reseeding, and those might need more individual care anyway. The urban web, tethered transit, and megacity growth. And just like cities today have green spaces amid skyscrapers, our orbital megacities may rely on linked parks, preserves, and agri-habs, connected by high-speed tethered transit systems. But you can hop on Tobias Rain's commuter train for a 30-minute tether ride to New Yosemite Nature Preserve. That changes the equation. Even speeds of a full kilometer per second are within reason for such a train system running along a tether, especially considering we already imagine higher speeds for our mass drivers and launch tracks. So whether New Yosemite is just next door or thousands of kilometers away, it's still a short trip. The same applies to our agrospheres. They could be tethered nearby or orbiting on the far side of the planet. And this brings us to why space megacities become more viable. Until fairly recently, most civilizations were essentially a large city surrounded by as much farmland as could be kept under direct control, militarily, politically, or economically. Larger empires were often just networks of such cities under a single unified banner. Improvements in agriculture and transportation were probably the two biggest factors allowing cities to grow. After all, a city can only get as large as the food it can reliably import permits. If 90% of what the farmers grow feeds the farmers themselves, and what's left can only be transported a few miles before spoiling, getting stolen, or getting sold elsewhere, then your city stays small. But add in railroads, freight trucks, refrigeration, and modern infrastructure like plumbing and sewers, and suddenly it's not only possible to bring in food from far away, it becomes routine. Meanwhile, tractors, fertilizers, and advanced farming methods mean a single farm doesn't just feed 10 people while supporting 6 or 7. It feeds hundreds, even thousands. That's a bit of a simplification, but it's the lion's share of why enormous, dense cities are even possible today, and why we imagine their analogs thriving in space tomorrow. A graphene tether, which is hardly our only means of transport in space, would have no problem allowing not just a freight truck, but entire container ships to zip around a distance far larger than we ship around nowadays, while far faster and for far less fuel. As a result, there is no real limit on city size from a food perspective that's particularly helped by growing your food locally. Realistically, you could ship in durable staple grains like wheat from huge wheat farms hundreds of millions of miles away. We talked about that in our Space Freighters episode, but even very perishable crops are now easy and cheap to bulk transport from thousands of miles away, even more so than nowadays, and examples like the bananas I bought an hour back that definitely are not getting grown here in Ohio. So any greenery in your habitat is there because people want it, and want it more than neighbors, or maybe it'd be more accurate to say more than they want another paying tenant. We already know there's room for such things in even the biggest cities, so I'd imagine the answer is an easy one. We have one other consideration too: light and heat. As a rule of thumb, the amount of light and electricity a person needs for daily operation is 100 times less than what the sun will shine down on their home and place of business, and this is without even making efforts at high efficiency, low lighting, or even just shutting the lights off in rooms nobody is in. Now, plants don't need constant noontime sun, and rotating habitats can have lots of extended radiators and cooling systems, running heat between them and the heat-generating bits of the station. And you also don't need full noontime sunlight all day to keep the plants healthy, so you can get away with half a dozen layers of greenery if you want, some cylindrical habitat with light bounced in or generated inside it to feed 6 layers of farm, each with some soil, and up in the highest layers is where you keep the livestock and anyone who needs to stay in your agri-hab, where your quarters are probably on top of an artificial hill to add more shielding along with a nice view, and your basements and walls are lined with shielding too. In much the same way, we could place a park level in the outermost layer of a ring or cylindrical habitat. Since that area already requires extra radiation shielding, it makes sense to locate green spaces there, places that benefit from both natural sunlight and additional protection. Beneath that park layer, we could store large tanks of water and other bulk material like hydrogen, which are excellent radiation shields and store well over time. In fact, those storage tanks don't even need to rotate. They don't benefit from artificial gravity, and spinning them only adds unnecessary structural stress. Anyone tending those reserves can safely do so in microgravity, perhaps with just a slight spin added to give a gentle sense of up and down to help with orientation. Meanwhile, the interior of the habitat could rise dozens, even hundreds of stories high, filled with apartments, shops, offices, schools, and everything else a thriving community might need. The practical limit here isn't height in the traditional sense, but heat. Your thermal budget is dictated by how much waste heat you can radiate away. Roughly 240 watts per square meter of external hull or radiative surface, the same average Earth emits into space, and more or less what we need in order to keep a habitat comfortable. To manage that heat, you could extend radiating mass from the habitat, use folded or crinkled surfaces to increase radiative area, and circulate cooling fluids to move heat to where it can be expelled. You might even build a large, non-rotating superstructure around the habitat dedicated entirely to heat rejection, connecting to the rotating core through fluid channels at the axis, where the rotation-induced forces are minimal. Done right, that system could even double as a stunning architectural feature, like an enormous waterfall pouring inward at either end cap of the station. Living in an orbital arcology might feel like science fiction, but so does the idea of effective immortality, and both could end up being real. Indeed, immortality may be mere decades away. My latest monthly exclusive episode explores the economics of immortality. What happens when the rarest thing in the universe, time itself, is no longer scarce? From medical nanobots to mind uploading, we dive into how immortality collides with society, wealth, and purpose. What does a society look like where someone might be 300 years old, look and feel 30, and be in the workplace and earning compound interest for multiple centuries? That's out now on Nebula, the largest creator-owned streaming service, where every episode of SFIA is available early and ad-free, and where I've been posting full-length exclusives like this one every month for years, along with extended editions, bonus content, and amazing originals from other creators. You can get all of that today for just $36 a year. That's only $3 a month, 40% off. Head to go.nebula.tv/IsaacArthur to join and start watching exclusive content like the economics of immortality. Spiral habitats, a rolled-up city in space. This brings us to a more radical vision, one that bends space, structure, and city into something new, the spiral habitat. What if we imagined a river civilization, not unlike ancient Egypt along the Nile, only inside a topopolis megastructure? Picture something several miles wide, but thousands or even millions of miles long, often envisioned with a single skinny civilization stretched along a central river or transport route. Now, instead of a flat ribbon of land with a river running down the middle and houses on either side, imagine that ribbon as a long strip of paper, then roll that ribbon up into a long spiral until you formed a thin ring or cylinder. You still have vertical movement, stairs or elevators inside tall buildings, but fundamentally, you now have a rolled-up city. And since you're not limited by gravity or terrain, it can have all the rivers or roads it wants. The real constraint in rotating habitats is width, not length, so wrapping the city up like a roll of gift wrap or an old map becomes entirely feasible. Let's take this concept further. Suppose we keep the idea of 100 total levels wrapped inside the spiral, and use the general dimensions of an O'Neill cylinder, with some added radiators and an average daylight level of 100 watts per square meter. We could allow the innermost and outermost levels to be relatively natural landscapes, with artificial sunlight, while still leaving us a remaining thermal budget of 200 watts per square meter, or about 2 watts per square meter per level. That's a tight but workable margin, especially with good thermal control and radiative infrastructure, plausible for an advanced spacefaring civilization. I am going to arbitrarily designate north as the direction that takes you up if you are walking the spiral, and south as downward or downhill. Density and design, population scaling. So just how big is this spiral city? Let's break down the numbers and compare it to the places we already know. Now, how tall we want these levels to be is largely arbitrary, but the default O'Neill cylinder is about 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers in radius. We can build much wider with modern materials, but let's stick to those classic dimensions for now. If we're willing to tolerate about 10% variation in gravity from top to bottom, that means the most uphill or northern district experience about 10% less gravity than those in the lowest, southernmost portion of our spiral habitat. This gives about 400 meters of vertical separation, 10% of the 4 kilometer radius, divided across 100 levels, which means each level averages 4 meters, about 13 feet in height. If we scale the radius up by a factor of 10, we could give each level 40 meters of vertical space, or about 130 feet, but we'll stick to the classic dimensions for now. As for length, there's far less structural strain from spinning a long cylinder than a wide one, so we can make it as long as we like. But by default, the Island 3 O'Neill cylinder is 32 kilometers or 20 miles long. With 100 spiral levels, we can now calculate the total internal surface area, which will be 95 normal O'Neill cylinders, not 100, as the innermost is only 90% of the area of the outermost. That total is 29,500 square miles, or 76,400 square kilometers, about the same area as Ireland, Sri Lanka, Panama, Maine, or South Carolina. Your default O'Neill cylinder is about a fifth the size of Long Island. This version is about 20 Long Islands rolled into a 20-mile long can. Main Street, or any other one running north and south along the whole spiral of the can, is about 2,400 miles long. And if you wanted to, you can make it go as far east and west too, lengthening the long axis of the spiral habitat. Talk about a big city grid. New York City is one of the densest urban areas in the world, averaging around 29,000 people per square mile, or roughly 11,200 per square kilometer. Most of the buildings there are not skyscrapers or even high-rises. The median is about 3 to 4 stories, which would be a bit much for our chosen layering. So we'd either want our habitat wider or accept a slightly wider range of gravity. But if you apply that density across the full interior surface of a 100-layer spiral O'Neill cylinder, you would be looking at a structure capable of housing approximately 856 million people. That's more than the combined population of the entire European Union and United States combined, all packed into a single megastructure only 20 miles long and 8 miles across. While such density would be extreme by today's suburban standards, it's a powerful testament to the efficiency of space habitats and a vision of humanity's potential to scale civilizations far beyond Earth's limits. Green limits: CO2, heat, and living space. But there's a ceiling, quite literally. Once we account for heat dissipation and the need for breathable air, green space becomes the real limiting factor. And while it's certainly possible to do away with it, using purely mechanical air scrubbers or outsourcing CO2 scrubbing to nearby agri-habitats, I suspect most habitats will want enough greenery on site to handle their own carbon dioxide. It's not just about function. There's a psychological and aesthetic value to having green space. Based on our earlier calculations, it takes about 2,000 to 3,000 watts of lighting per person to grow the plants need to scrub their daily CO2 output. We can tweak the light and plant choices to optimize that, but let's settle on 2,400 watts per person as our working estimate. Given that our radiative heat budget is capped at 240 watts per square meter, that means we need about 10 square meters of radiating surface per person just to cool the lighting systems for CO2 scrubbing plants. With the default O'Neill cylinder, or our spiral habitat variant, offering around 800 million square meters of radiating whole surface, that puts a practical population cap at around 80 million people. There are plenty of ways to distribute that green space: garden plots per home, strips of greenery along roads and walkways, shady rooftop gardens, and scattered parks. You can offload some heat and CO2 using active circulation systems, but just like with traffic congestion and sewage in Earth cities, practical maximums begin to emerge. As with terrestrial arcologies, the need to feed people and shed waste heat becomes the defining constraint, preventing a future where every square meter of living area is capped by mile-high towers. The spiral hab model is ideal for denser urban-style living, where most of the space is enclosed and artificially lit, but can also scale down well for more suburban layouts. You can grow shade-tolerant plants or slower-growing grasses that do not need full sunlight, and in all cases, you can trim out the infrared portion of the sunlight, roughly half the spectrum, which plants don't use and which just becomes waste heat. And of course, if you had some trick to purge heat entirely, some thermodynamics-defying technology, or a Stargate-like portal you could dump heat through, then these habitats scale up dramatically. In such a case, a Megacities cylinder, 100 times wider, could support 1,000 spiral layers, each still enjoying a spacious skyline and complex terrain. With some interesting horizons, though as with all such habitats, I think you use a lot of hills and valleys to break up the unnatural horizon of a rotating habitat, and they are 100 times longer too, so you could be packing 100,000 times more folks in this version than our baseline O'Neill spiral hab we outlined. Trillions of folks. The future of orbital urbanization, Terran swarms and beyond. And the natural next step, taking this model and scaling it up, not just into a single habitat, but into a vast interconnected swarm orbiting Earth like a miniature Dyson cloud. As we discussed elsewhere, a Terran swarm, a dense cluster of habitats and solar collectors filling out cislunar space all the way to the edge of Earth's hillsphere, would have a cross-sectional area over 55,000 times larger than Earth's own when viewed from the Sun's perspective. That alone suggests it could support at least that many times more people than Earth does today, and likely far more, given how much of Earth's surface is covered by oceans or land that we neither farm nor fully inhabit. A population of several quadrillion people could be supported with the same average spaciousness we enjoy now in terms of usable land area. In that context, giant orbital arcologies, whether spiral habitats, immense city-scale conglomerates of modules, or both, becomes not only plausible but arguably inevitable. Cities in orbit housing billions or even low trillions of people begin to feel like a natural evolution of urban life once we start building outward from Earth. And the reason people move here is simple: it's still right next to Earth. You can place your massive solar collectors and staple crop farms further out if you like, raising your population potential even higher, but everyone in the Terran swarm is still orbiting Earth. Most may be fairly distant, but even those on the outer edge are just a few light seconds from home. I suspect the largest cities are still clustered up near geostationary orbit, where a signal can reach any point on Earth and return in well under a second. Earth itself may be heavily urbanized by this point, but probably not completely. It's a unique place, and while you can't build mile-high skyscrapers there, using the same arcology rules as in space, it all comes down to heat dissipation. There will still be plenty of land that's never developed. Some areas won't be for sale, whether ancestral homes, tribal lands, or just property someone's holding out on for a better offer. So instead, we see orbital space fill up with new land, where travel between habitats may actually be faster and easier than on Earth, especially if we have functioning space elevators. That would allow people to travel between Earth and orbit with no more effort than crossing continents today. This might result in a wide mix of rural, suburban, and natural settings, but if you're on manufacturing land, urban sprawl is far more cost-effective per person than small-scale farming. Even if most habitats are countryside or parklands, there's still a substantial number that are highly urbanized, and it's likely that most people live in those. Geostationary habitats hanging over the same spot on Earth, or even those suspended on orbital rings right over Earth in low orbit, where they could use Earth's own gravity instead of spin gravity, and we might have some more traditional arcology like a giant pyramid seeming to just levitate over some stretch of the deep ocean, with tethers running out to major coastal cities a couple hundred miles below. And as we glimpsed in our opening story today, and will continue to explore later this month in our episode on space habitat clusters, these orbital arcologies may very well become the beating hearts of orbital nations, vast and vibrant civilizations that could dwarf even the grandest galactic empires imagined in classic science fiction. And somewhere on the line, Tobias Rain still rides, gliding through the arteries of humanity's greatest city, just another day's commute among the stars. We'll see where else he takes us next time as we continue our journey through High Atlantis in a couple of weeks.